would like to introduce our second speaker, Professor Ruth Halperin Kadari. Professor Halperin Kadari is a graduate of the Yale Law School, professor at Bar-Ilan University Faculty of Law, and a founding academic director of the Rachman Center at Bar-Ilan University. Professor Halperin Kadari is a family law expert in both civil legal system and Jewish religious law, and has served for 12 years as the member, twice vice president of the United Nations Committee on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. She publishes on family law in Israel, feminism and halakha, international women's rights, and international human rights family law. Her book on women in Israel was published by Pennsylvania University Press. She's a recipient of national and international research grants and prizes, including the U.S. State Department's Women of Courage Award, and was named on Apolitical's 100 Most Influential People in Gender Policy Worldwide. Professor Halperin Kadari, thank you for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It gives me really great pleasure to be with you, even though not physically. I do miss New Haven. And I see many friends on Zoom, and I suppose that some of them are over there in person. But thanks to the technology, and thanks for 2.5 years of COVID, I think we all got used to the possibility of just seeing each other via the screens. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk together with my good friend and colleague on the same law faculty with Itai about what we're facing here in Israel. And I really appreciate the fact that you are involved, that you do want to know more, to hear more, and hopefully really to be more involved, because I think that what happens in Israel does impact the Jewish world worldwide. So as Gershon said, I'm going to focus on the issue of what is at stake for women in Israel on account of this judicial overhaul. And I am going to share my screen if I can do that. Okay, I hope you can all see. Yeah, I just, if you can nod your heads so that I know that, okay, thank you. So this is my opening statement, and what I hope to do in the next few minutes, or the time that I was allocated, to convince you that we are indeed at a turning point in Israel, and women in Israel are facing today the biggest threat to our status, to our rights, and to the rights of our daughters since the founding of the State of Israel. And let us first just go back in history and recall some things that we all do not often think about, and maybe even prefer to forget. I'm sure you're all familiar with these visuals, with these pictures. These are obviously not from Israel. These are from the US during World War I, the suffragists who fought for their very basic rights to vote, the right to be elected, the franchise. And we only won that, or you in the States only won that a little more than 100 years ago, which is really like a flickering of an eye in terms of human history. And I know that many of you are not aware of the fact that women in Israel have also had to fight for our rights to vote and to be elected, the right for office. And these are just some banners, which my good friend, curator Nurit Yacob-Sinon got together for an exhibition a couple of years ago, commemorating the struggle within Israel, more accurately within pre-state Israel or pre-state Palestine, between 1918 to 1926, a very bitter struggle. And the women then had to fight against the old establishment in Israel, which was basically the ultra-Orthodox, who opposed, and you can see on the right-hand side here, the name of Harav Kook, who was then heading the Jewish establishment in Israel, and who opposed the rights of women to vote and to be elected for office. And I'm mentioning this because everything that's happening now, we do have to put it within the historical context. And let's now move fast forward and recall the fact that we women in Israel, when we started this process, or when this process of the judicial reform or overhaul started, our starting point was very, very low to begin with. Let's just look at these 5 small bowls, and these are not reflective of everything, but we don't usually remember this on a daily basis. We almost take it for granted as a natural given. But there is no civil marriage and divorce in Israel, right? Everybody, men and women, are subject to their own religious laws. And I regret to say, and I say it in very heavy heart, as a committed Jew, but each of the religious laws that are in charge over marriage and divorce in Israel, whether it is the Jewish law, whether it is the Sharia law, the Druze law, or ecclesiastical laws, they all can compete with each other on who is more patriarchal and which one is more discriminatory against women. And I'm sorry to say that Jewish law might be the first runner-up in discriminating against women, primarily at the point of divorce. And I won't go into that right now. We can do that in the Q&A part. But let's move on. We are facing decreasing rates of women's representation in public life. We are facing unwavering, unchanging wage gaps, which are the largest in the, or second to largest in the OECD countries, more than 30% of wage gaps between the average salary or the average income of men versus women. We are facing increasing rates of domestic violence. All women in the world faced terrible increase during COVID, but the rates in Israel are even higher. And I don't know if you read the papers now, but within these past weeks, today, the 9th woman died. 9 women were murdered since the beginning of this month, March. And we are increasing more and more gender segregation. And all this is before this judicial reform had started. So where are we now? I just want to, pose a few rhetorical questions. Does it make sense that a disloyal wife would lose her rights to the family home? This is not a hypothetical question. This is a case that took place in Israel a couple of years ago, where the rabbinical court, on account of alleged claims against the wife of being disloyal to her husband, lost her rights to the family home. This was taken to the High Court of Justice. At the first round in the High Court of Justice, 3 judges, male judges, decided 2-1, decided to uphold the decision of the rabbinical court. And only when we intervened, and by we, I'm referring to the Rachman Center, we intervened on behalf of the wife of the woman, and we asked the president of the High Court of Justice to grant the procedure of rehearing a case, which is a very rare procedure. And the president agreed. The case was reheard, this time a panel of 9 judges, including women, and the decision of the rabbinical court was overturned. Let's move on to the second poll. Are we fine with the fact that female professors are barred from teaching male students? Again, this is not a hypothetical question. This is still, unfortunately, the reality, de facto reality, but it's not legal at present because an appeal was taken to the High Court of Justice, and in 2021, the High Court of Justice decided that even though the ambition, the plan to have more and more ultra-Orthodox men and women enter academic studies, this is a noble target for the government, for the state of Israel. It is the interest of everybody to include ultra-Orthodox people within the workforce, and for that you have to give them the possibility to gain academic education, and they require gender segregation. So this point of gender segregation within academic studies was taken as an appeal to the High Court of Justice, and the judges partially approved. They said gender segregation is discrimination, but it is for justifiable purpose. However, they prohibited the prohibition of women teachers, women professors teaching male students. As I said before, this still goes on because unfortunately the Council of Higher Education does not really supervise this. But right now it is illegal. As we will see in the next few minutes, this is going to be completely legal when and if and when the judicial reform is passed. Third bullet here, or third bull here, is it okay that in public transportation, women may only sit at the back of the bus? Again, it's not hypothetical. Again, this is what's happening in many, many public transportation buses in Israel. But right now, it is illegal to require women to sit at the back of the bus. And this is illegal, once again, because an appeal to the High Court of Justice was taken by several women in 2011, and the High Court of Justice ruled that it is illegal to require women to sit at the back of the bus. And as I said before, this is going to be legal if and when the judicial overhaul is passed. So where do we start right now? Okay, where can we seek, who can we trust? Who can we count on to safeguard our rights? These are pictures of the current government. And as I said, as I wrote here in French, cherchez la femme, look for the women. The numbers of women within the current regime, within the current government, are extremely, extremely minuscule. Let's start with the Knesset. We have 29 members of the parliament out of 120. But as Itai explained before, what really counts is how many are in the coalition parties, which are basically the government, from which the government is formed. And here we only have 10 women coalition members out of 64, but the truth is that we should look at that as out of 80 because of the very strange, we didn't have time to go into that, but we have this system of members of parliament who were being elected can resign from the parliament once they become ministers, and then others on the party list come and replace them. So basically we have 80 members belonging to the coalition, and only 10 out of them are female. We only have 6 ministers out of 31 portfolios and five vice ministers, only 6. This is really a record low in recent decades. We only have 4 women who had Knesset committees out of 27 committees. And we only have 1 director general who's in charge of government ministry. And even this one stayed from the former government. So no female, no woman was appointed as a director general for a government office by this government in this regime. So this is the reality of the women's representation. But the real question is, how does the weakening of the High Court of Justice, how does it affect us as women? And once again, I want to go back to recall, and Israeli friends here, I think, are very familiar with some of the names of the cases which I wrote down here. And I really only picked the major highlights. I could have detailed here at least 30 major precedent-setting cases by the High Court of Justice, which developed the rights for women and the gender equality in Israel. So the Bavli case in 95 and the anonymous case in 2001. The anonymous case is the one which I already described a few minutes ago, where the disloyal wife lost her property rights by the rabbinical court, and the High Court of Justice overturned this decision. And by that, it actually followed the 1995 precedent-setting case by Justice Aaron Barak, one of the more important decisions by Justice Barak. I had the privilege of clerking for Justice Barak when he wrote this decision. It's really interesting that Itai clerked for Justice Elon and I clerked for Justice Barak. And as Itai explained, they were very good friends, but they were real rivals over the questions of judicial activism and the question of justiciability. We can expand on that later. Moving on, 1988, the Shakdiel and the Poraz, 2 cases that came together where decisions by, one was a decision by the government and the other one was a decision by the municipal council, both of them actually to exclude women from serving in semi-religious roles, one in a religious municipality, in religious council of the municipality, and the other one in the body that elects the municipal rabbi. And on religious grounds, and going back to where we started this conversation about the objection to women's elections and to women's holding office, objection by religious establishment, by the ultra-Orthodox establishment, then these objections keep on appearing time after time. And these 2 cases, the Shakdiel and Poraz case, really demonstrate them reappearing towards the end of the 20th century, just like they appeared at the beginning of the 20th century. And we see that the High Court of Justice stepped in and overturned these decisions. 1990, the Nevo decision, which abolished a clause at a collective agreement that actually required women to retire at the age of 60 and unlike their male colleagues who had the privilege to retire only at 65 or at 67. And if it weren't for the High Court of Justice, many of us would still be required to retire at an earlier age and not given a choice to continue working, to continue and continue be employed and continue to gain pension rights. The last decision that I put here from 2012, a decision where the court invalidated a provision in the income assurance law. And this one is more important, connecting it to Itai's presentation, because this is one of the 22 cases in all these years, in all these decades, only 22 times the High Court of Justice actually invalidated a provision in a law. And this case was one of those 22 cases where the provision was that if a claimant to the income assurance benefit had access to a car, and in this case there were 5 unmarried mothers. All 5 were divorcees. The 5 single mothers who really needed this income assurance benefit, and they all had access to a car from a friend or from a family member, from parents, and this alone denied them. The law said that because of this, they were ineligible to receive that benefit. And the High Court of Justice said this is really disproportionately violating or infringing the right to live in dignity. So this is an example where the court stepped in and invalidated a provision. Now, what's going to happen if these plans pass? And by the way, in the images here, you see the ongoing images of the handmaids. I'm not sure if you had already been exposed to this. This is a recurring theme in the civil uprising, as Itai described in the protests. It's very powerful. It's very strong imagery that its purpose is, of course, to associate all our fears of what lies ahead for women, associated with Gilead, with The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, and the Netflix show that I'm sure many of you had watched. So what's going to happen? If they enact, for instance, a law that requires women to sit at the end of the bus, will the High Court of Justice now be able to intervene? Probably not, because as Itai explained, the actual right to equality is not expressly guaranteed in the basic law, human dignity and liberty. And even if some of the judges would expand the right to dignity and say, well, it's not expressly, equality is not expressly guaranteed, but we think that it is expressly guaranteed in the words of dignity, it's never going to reach the supermajority that is going to be needed to overturn a provision in a law. And even if the most unlikely thing will happen, and anonymously the judges will overturn such a provision as discriminatory and as going against the dignity of the women, not just equality, but violating their dignity, in that case, the override clause would step in, and the Knesset, the parliament, will be able to enact this law again. Now, all these are really not just threats and alarms or false alarms. This, for Hebrew readers, is the cover of the Haaretz magazine this was not the cover of Haaretz magazine. This was the alternative cover of Haaretz magazine, written by some of us feminist activists and academics, delineating all the laws. It says Ve'ele HaChukim, all the laws that are in the pipeline and that will take us back to very, very dark times in terms of women's rights. And I just want to take a few more minutes to actually talk about what is already concretely planned. And what I delineated here relies on everything that's in the coalition agreements between the Likud and the other parties. And some of the things here have already started their enactment process. So from left to right, allowing discrimination in services and provisions on grounds of religious belief. This actually means that if the bakery down the street, the owner of the bakery does not really feel comfortable in serving women, or maybe his clients do not feel comfortable in the presence of women, they will be allowed to set separate times for women and for men, or he might be allowed to require that if a woman enters his establishment, his store, she must be covered. You know, if she wears a short sleeve shirt, he's not going to let her in. Or take another example, which is maybe close to home for US audience, unfortunately. If a pharmacist feels that contraceptives are against his or even her religious belief, they will no longer be willing to sell them, and that will be okay. They will not. Nobody can require them to sell or to serve maybe contraceptives to an unmarried woman or an unmarried man for that purpose. So all this lies in this small box of allowing discrimination in provision of services, expanding gender segregation in public spaces, cultural events, or in academia. So all the plans for gender segregation, which we have already been experiencing in the last decade, are going to expand, and there will be no way to restrict them. And as I said, including in academic studies. The third box here, the Istanbul Convention. The Istanbul Convention is the Council of Europe Convention on the prevention and combating violence against women and domestic violence. It's considered the gold standard of what a government, what a state can and must do if it really commits to fight gender-based violence and domestic violence. And it's open to all countries in the world. We worked very hard for more than 5 years, women's organization led by the Reckman Center with people from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And in the last government, the change government, we reached a very, very close point where the Council of Europe already invited Israel to join in to ratify this convention. And all that was needed was just the final decision by the government. At that point, all right-wing organizations, religious organizations, many of whom are in fact now in the government or identified with the government, started raising all kinds of arguments against, mostly fake arguments, frightening from the country is going to be flooded by asylum seekers, by women from Sudan who might flee from gender-based violence against them. Again, we can expand on that in the QA, but what we are now facing is, is a decision, a commitment within the coalition agreements not to join the Istanbul Convention. Instead of promising in coalition agreements to expand rights and to do what's really good for the people and to commit to, to promise many, many things, here, for the first time ever, we're faced with the decision that we're not going to really do what is needed to fight violence against women. Expansion of the rabbinical courts jurisdiction. Right now, the jurisdiction of the rabbinical courts is restricted to matters of marriage and divorce. What is now at stake is expanding the jurisdiction purportedly by mutual consent of both parties, but the jurisdiction will now be expanded to cover all civil matters, all commercial matters, and also property matters between ex-couples, ex-husband, ex-wife. And the issue of consent is very, very doubtful when you take, for instance, a school teacher, a Haredi, ultra-Orthodox school teacher who badly needs the job to make ends meet, and the organization, the owner of the school asks her to sign up that if ever she wants to sue them, for instance, for not paying her or the amount that she was promised or other matters, she must bring these claims to the rabbinical court and not to the labor court. It's extremely doubtful whether you can really attribute true consent and free choice in these situations. But this is, and this really is going to hurt more or to harm more ultra-Orthodox women than any other group of women. I think I'll stop here. I won't explain all these other boxes. I believe you got the picture, and I do want to leave time for questions. I just want to end with note of hope. And the note of hope is in these images. This is one of the leaders of the civil uprising, an academic colleague of ours, not from law, but from, what is it? Is she a chemist or a physicist? I don't remember right now. She's one of the leaders, and of course you can see whom she's compared to, Liberty, and two other extremely powerful women are fighting back against the male chauvinist government. On the left side is President of the High Court of Justice, Supreme Court, Justice Esther Chayut. And on the right hand is the Attorney General, Gali Baharav Miara. And if you follow the Israeli news, you can see how courageous and how powerful these two women are. And we're at the eve of Pesach. And I think that some of us know this saying, which I wrote here in Hebrew, בזכות נשים צדקניות נגאלו ישראל ממצרים, ובזכותן עתידין להיגאל. And well, this is my translation. Thanks to, or on account of righteous women, Israel were redeemed. And thanks to them, they will be redeemed again. And let us hope that this will indeed be the case this time too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Halperin Kadari. And we'd like to take questions from the audience.
Thank you both very much for enlightening, if not disheartening presentation. I have a specific question, and that is the legal status of Israel's Declaration of Independence, which, as you know, is not a constitution, but does enshrine the values of equality for minorities within Israel, ethnic, religious, and so forth. And some people say that it's just aspirational, has no legal force, but others say in the absence of a constitution that it is relied upon or invoked by the court. One worries, and of course we as Jews know that you can't trust the majority to uphold the rights of the minority, as our history has taught us. But if this coup takes place, and presumably one of the first targets is the basic law of human dignity and liberty, it leaves the Declaration of Independence up there without much support. So does it have any legal authority? I've heard or read both.
Itai, do you want to start? Can you unmute, Itai?
Yes, thank you. So thank you for this question. This is actually a very complex question, and there have been various answers throughout Israeli history. The short answer is that the Declaration of Independence is not a constitutional text. And how do we know? Because the Declaration of Independence itself says that there would be elections to an electoral council that would create a constitution. And also in the very first years of the country's independence, there were cases petitioning the court and asked the court to say that our Declaration of Independence, like our constitution, and the court said no. But as you correctly said, it is enshrining our basic values and the beliefs of our founding fathers, and therefore legislation could be interpreted according to it, but not invalidated because it's not a constitution. Having said that, there's two qualifications to what I said until now. One is in our basic laws, human dignity and liberty and the freedom of occupation, our so-called Bill of Rights enacted in 1992. It's for the first time in their first article, they say that the rights in Israel should be respected in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. And some judges interpret it as giving it a special constitutional status, which again is not a constitution, but still more than just a formal declaration that has no legal force. And the last thing I would say that not in the case law of the court, but in academic writing of Aaron Barak after he retired, he has a theory saying that the power of the Knesset to enact basic laws is subordinate to the very basic values of the state as enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. He has various arguments for it, but part of it is the way that the Declaration of Independence, which again would say that we'll have a constitution, it also sets some restrictions about this constitution. So there could be this kind of theory. Will the court ever accept this theory? This is an open question.
I think I don't have anything to add to what Itai just explained.
Obviously, I'd like to thank both of you for informing us. Obviously, we're here today because we have some concerns about what we read and see happening in Israel and what some of us believe is undercutting the democratic state, particularly the judicial court reform. But my question is related to, so what do we do? Because there's been a tricky relationship between American Jews and Israeli Jews. My understanding in the past is that we're expected to be supportive, period. Support through money and advocacy. And anytime there's any criticism of what's going on in Israel, we're told, you don't know what it's like, you're not here, the rest of that. So if we want to do anything that might be helpful, what could we do? We certainly don't want to stop sending funds because we know there are groups that are demonstrating and are helping the groups we care about. Should we be contacting our representatives? That's very tricky, because do we want them to speak out in Congress about Israel? I doubt if they would, because they count on the Jewish vote. And in this country today, with the rise of anti-Semitism, that would be dangerous. So what do you suggest we do?
So I'll start. This is a very difficult question for us to answer. And of course, I'm not suggesting that we can put ourselves in your position, just like you rightly said, that when you raise doubt and questions, then very often the response is that you cannot judge us because you're not in our position. However, I think that we can say several things. First of all, supporting Israel does not necessarily mean supporting the government or the current government of Israel. I believe that just like we in Israel, which is still a democracy, have every right to object to what the current government is doing, likewise, your loyalty to Israel should not be questioned if you express critiques and objections, and maybe even actively support those who object to the current government. If you share our, Itai and my, and for instance, the group that we belong to, the Forum of Law Professors for Democracy, if you share our concerns, if you share the way that we see things here as real danger, real threat to the democratic character of the state that all of us cherish and love and care for, then I actually think that it is your duty to take a stand and to also take an active stand and there are many ways to do that. The way that you've been supporting, the support can now support those who, if you share this feeling, who are fighting to save Israel as a democracy. As to your question about your own internal political stance within the US, especially in light of growing anti-Semitism, I think this is, personally, I think this is something which is beyond what is legitimate for me here personally to address.
I too want to thank both of you. It's an issue that I care a lot about, democracy. But I also want to address what to me is the elephant in the room about democracy, that there is the whole population of Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza, the West Bank certainly ruled by military law, not civilian law. It's not part of those people are not part of the democracy. So I just think that's an important part of the conversation and something else that needs to change.
I'll start with a short answer, and then maybe Tai wants to add. Thank you for this comment. I agree. I belong to those who say that even before what we're now going through, Israel has never been a full democracy. It's always been a flawed democracy. First and foremost, on what you rightly pointed out, the fact that there is ongoing occupation over millions of Palestinians who are not being awarded rights, active control over their lives without allowing them to have the rights to control their own lives, and also on accounts of other flaws, just as I said in my talk, a violation of numerous other basic rights in Israel, such as the right to marry and to divorce. And I think it's really a subject for a whole different and much longer discussion of the ways that all these are connected, the way that the occupation and the ongoing conflict has fueled into what we are now facing in Israel. And I really don't think that we have time to go into that. What I'm afraid is that if this plan is indeed materializing, any hope for just resolve of the conflict will no longer be possible. Itai, do you want to add? We need you to unmute.
Thank you. Yeah, so I will stop muting myself so I won't be unmuted all the time. Sorry. So very, very briefly, just I agree with Ruth's answers to both questions. So what can you do? As I said, I don't know if you heard my opening remarks, but I really feel this situation that being uncomfortable, because just like in your culture as American Jews, you support Israel no matter what. The way I was brought out is we criticize Israel within Israel, and we never criticize Israel outside of Israel, even if we are completely opposed to what our government is doing. I think that currently we're in such a dire state, and there's a real danger to Israeli democracy, that if you care about Israel, you need to speak up for democracy. And in my personal opinion, what we're doing is not unpatriotic, but the exact opposite. And I think the same thing, that if you love Israel, you do have to speak up for democracy in Israel. What does it mean? Does it mean also talking with your governmental officials to pressure Israeli officials? I don't know. I'm more hesitant about that, but for sure, contacting the Israeli embassy, contacting the Israeli government, saying, and many leading Jewish organizations have already done so and said, listen, we're very anxious about what's going on currently in Israeli democracy. We urge you to rethink it, or at least don't do it in such a bulldozing blitz of a one-sided legislative process, and at least do it in a participatory, deliberative process that reaches wide agreements. I think this is something that as Ruti said, it's very difficult for us to say what you should do, but this is something that I think is something that if I would have been in your position, I would feel comfortable. Sorry, and the question about the occupation. So
giving us the facts about the proposed changes. I'm wondering if you could put on a different hat for a minute and explain to us the position of the maybe majority of Israelis who seem to be supporting the government in this role, and how they justify these changes.
Okay, so I'll start with the facts. The majority of Israeli population is against, and there's many polls since the government was formed And this is a very important point because the populist argument by the Minister of Justice is that we're doing what the people want and the elites are fighting us. But in fact, the majority and consistent majority of Israeli population in all polls opposes these reforms. This is a very important point. And the amazing thing is that even a substantial percentage of people who voted for the current coalition oppose it, especially from the Likud. To be fair, from the ultra-Orthodox and extreme right parties, I would say that probably most voters do support it, but the vast majority of Israelis in general, and even a sizable proportion of voters from the Likud actually oppose it. So this is the first point. The second point, yes, I think there are various arguments and motivations for this reform. As I said, some of them are completely legitimate and based on legitimate motives. I think there's two things. One is, how do you see democracy? And there's just whether you see democracy in what I view as a narrow view of democracy, that basically democracy means elections, and once you have a majority elected, it should be able to do whatever it wants without any checks and balances. Or do you see democracy as also including this part, which is, again, of course, very fundamental and crucial, but also the protection of human rights, protections of minorities, checks and balances, etc. So I can tell you that we're now doing these discussions all the time. Only this morning, I was in a debate with the vice chairman of Kohelet. So if you don't know who they are a very right-wing think tank that, according to newspaper publications, are the most important think tank behind this reform. So, you know, I'm aware of their arguments and respect them as a smart and sensible people. But I think a very large part of it is just a matter of what model of democracy and what model of government you want. So this is one point. The other is an empirical question. Is it true that the government in Israel is really so restrained and unable to pass policy, and the parliament is really so much in the hands of the legal system that they can't act? I think here we have a very strong disagreement on the facts of the matter, and to what extent we have a problem of governmentability and the ability of government to pass its policy and enact its policy. And also, as I said, it's just a matter of whether we'll have other checks and balances. And as I said, one of the problems, if the reformers would say, okay, we feel that the judicial system is too strong and it should be weakened, but to combat that or to balance it, we'll also make changes in our system that will have an entrenched constitution with a Bill of Rights. The government won't be able to change the basic laws whenever they want. There would be other checks and balances, perhaps create another House of Parliament, etc. I would be open to those kind of things. The thing is that the supporters of the reform say the biggest problem is that the judicial system is too strong. The people who oppose it say the biggest problem is the government is too strong as it is, and without the courts, there won't be anything else cabining the government. So I think it's partly a matter of what model of government you want to have. And the other one is an empirical question of to what extent the government is really excessively restrained by the legal system, and what would happen the day after. And I can say that one of the questions that many people pose to the supporters of the reform is, okay, so what happens, say the reform passes, like Ruti said, okay, what happens the day after, right? So the question is, who would protect our rights? Who would protect women's rights? Who would protect LGBTQ rights? Who would protect Arab minority rights, etc.? And the answer they give is trust the political process and trust the politicians. And if they will abridge rights too much, you can count on the elections that they will be changed. And this is the answer. Again, I'm presenting their argument. I think it is a wrong argument because not because I have disdain toward elected politicians or I have a rosy picture of judges, but basically you can't have a constitutional system based on trust the government, it will be fine and they will do nothing to violate rights. And also because elections are a very, and I wrote about it, by the way, in a few articles about the American system, why elections are a very inefficient way to enable the accountability of elected representatives over specific decisions, as opposed to general policy choices. Because when you go, there's a lot to say about it and we don't have time, but at the end of the day, people vote because of various reasons. They do not change their vote because the reason that of how a specific parliament member voted in a specific case, and you have only one vote in each election. You don't vote to one party because of their human rights policy, and the another party because of their environmental policy, and the third party for their social policy, etc. And at the end of the day, in Israel, most people vote because of their views about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or things like that, and not because of whether and to what extent they're happy or unhappy with how various members of parliament voted on various bills regarding rights. So elections themselves are very important. They're crucial. We have to protect them, but they're not a sufficient check if they're the only check that we have. And this is the problem, that they would be the only check. And another point, what we learned from Hungary and Poland and other places is that populist leaders, that they have this view of democracy, that democracy means just free elections, and then whoever gets the vote of the people can do whatever they want. At the end of the day, they use their power to change the rules of elections that at the end of the day, they're not really, there's no real fair elections, and then you can't change the government. Even this very narrow, and in my view, too narrow view of democracy is not upheld and is also at risk.
I'll just add one sentence here and respond to the question with a question. How do you explain the fact, if I'm not wrong, that 70% of Republicans still believe the quote unquote theory of the stolen elections in the US by Biden? I think that media, social media, Fox News, and in Israel, the equivalent of Fox News, Channel 14, I think they have a lot in explaining why major parts of Israeli society do support this plan. As Itai said, this is definitely not the majority of Israeli society right now, but there still are large groups of Israeli society, right-wing, mostly ultra-Orthodox. So one thing is the role that social media and manipulation and fake industry has in this, and the other is the global trend of growing populist regimes that lead to backsliding democracies. So we see very, very similar patterns to what had taken place in Hungary, in Poland, in Turkey, in India, in many countries in South America, Latin America. And when you add to that the very acute political situation, security situation in Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians, the ongoing conflict, you see the rise of politicians like Itamar Ben-Gvir. So this also are very important factors to take into consideration when we try to understand the sentiments of the public.
Sorry about that.
So we've run a little bit behind on time. We'll stay here for open discussion.
In fact, I'm going to invite people to come outside of this room. I feel like everybody's been sitting for a while. There's some coffee and tea that you can make in our Kiddush lounge just outside this room, and chairs, more comfy chairs for people to sit, continue the conversation. And a huge thank you to everyone for organizing, and for our speakers for joining us. You guys wanted to say a few words about what goes on in New Haven?
So hi everyone. My name is Benji. I'd first like to, Gershon. So sure, I'd first like to thank Gershon and Owen for putting together this event, and our distinguished speakers for getting us better and informed. So both Gershon, Owen, and myself were Israeli academics based here at Yale, and this is all basically a result of some spontaneous organization that we've been putting together in the last month or so. Many of us who have not previously known each other until we became so increasingly concerned with the situation back at home. We sort of thought that we ought to do something about it, and we're slowly trying to figure out what the answer to that is. Specifically, we thought our context as academics is a bit of a unique one, as, for example, both Oren and I were postdoctoral fellows here, which means that once we finish our academic training in Israel, we go abroad for a few years to strike academic connections and improve our training before returning back home. And our feelings watching the events back home unfold for the last 6 months or so is we're not quite sure what sort of country will be there by the time we're ready to make our return. So we'd like to invite you, if you think this cause is near and dear to you as it is to us. One of the things we've come up with, both to show our support to friends and family back home, to make our voices heard, and not be neglected even though we're geographically abroad, and to join other Israeli communities and expatriates abroad. We've been putting together these support rallies in central New Haven on Yale campus. In fact, we're heading there right outside once this event is concluded. So if you would like to join forces with us and make your voice on this matter heard as well, we meet every Sunday regularly on Yale campus, and I invite you to join us. Thank you. It's usually about 3 o'clock. We're putting it off to 3:30 today, so we all have time to drive out if you'd like to meet us there.
Posted time is 3:30.
For today it is, yes, 3:30.
Well, I guess with that, huge thank you to everyone. That'll be it. Thank you. Thank you all.